Greetings, skeleton warriors, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Since tis the season, old Uncle Sigmar has brought you a gift. Open it. Yes, we're going to cover a Warhammer fantasy book, more specifically Warhammer Armies Undead. It was written by Jervis Johnson and Bill King and was released in 1994 for use in Warhammer's 4th edition. This makes it roughly analogous to the 2nd edition 40k codices we've covered. And we hope that helps us since, as we've mentioned one or two times before, Warhammer Fantasy is not exactly our area of expertise.
Basically, most of our experience with Warhammer Fantasy comes from playing far too much Vermintide 2.
But we are going to give it our best shot, so please don't get mad if we mess something up.
In the Warhammer world, the dead do not rest easy. Vampires lurk in haunted castles in the sinister forests of Sylvania. Necromancers seek to escape their mortality by searching for forbidden knowledge within the pages of accursed books. In the lost cities buried beneath the desert sands of the land of the dead, the Tomb Kings rule over legions of corpses, their servants in death as they were in life. And behind all of this towers the gigantic shadowy figure of Nagash, the great necromancer once human but now powerful enough to rival the gods themselves.
The first thing of note about this book is that it's just generic undead, so it encompasses what would later be split into several factions, and by the time we hit Age of Sigmar, it, very broadly speaking, represents the entire Grand Alliance death. We don't think it's a coincidence that every name used since is something much more easy for Games Workshop to copyright than undead. This all means the units in this book ran the entire gamut of supernatural horrors, some still in the game and some not. And when we said it was similar to the 2nd edition 40k codices, we weren't kidding. Even having never played Warhammer Fantasy during this era, these 4th edition army books feel very familiar. Which makes sense, since not only did they come out around the same time, but they both were the first editions of their respective games to have dedicated army books for each faction. Beforehand, having to rely on things like the Ravening Hordes book or stuff in White Dwarf.
Just like in 2nd edition 40k, how an army was structured was that each force had an allowance of different unit types that they could take a certain percentage of, with some things being mandatory. Most of the units in this book caused fear in their opponents and were immune to such things themselves, you know, on account of being spooky ghouls and ghosts. Probably should have done this in October. However, an undead army was incredibly reliant on its force's leader, because if they were killed then most of the army would just crumble to dust or disappear into the ether. For characters available in this book, you had undead generals, battle standards, heroes, champions, and necromancers, most coming in a variety of flavours. For example, the hero can be a vampire count, a mummy tomb king, or a white lord. And all have the option of buying a mount, whether it be the humble skeleton horse or something more exotic. For your basic regiments, there were skeleton horsemen, zombies, ghosts, ghouls, wights, mummies, wraiths, and carrion, who were like zombie birds, zombirds. Their war machines are a little less varied, having only screaming skull catapults and undead chariots. However, there was a large variety of monsters you could take, from the imposing zombie dragons and giant scorpions to, like, lizards. Just a whole bunch of lizards.
Imagine being a general, facing off against the undead horde. Legions of reanimated corpses shambling towards you in a crude mockery of life. Flanked by thousands upon thousands of frogs. You could also take allies from the Chaos, Skaven, or Dark Elves list if you so desired. As you can imagine, given the nature of the units, many of them had interesting rules attached. For example, the skeletal horses could discorporeate and move through walls. Ghosts and wraiths, unsurprisingly, could also do this. Mummies, being drier than Ben Shapiro's wife, were like tinder and suffered double wounds from fire-based attacks. And ghouls wouldn't chase down their enemies if they were forced to fall back, since they were too busy eating the corpses of the fallen. You know, as you do. Zombie dragons were also pretty rad. They were surrounded by a cloud of flies that like to crawl into the eyes, ears, and any other available orifices of anyone attacking the dragon, so enemies had a -1 to hit in close combat due to the distraction. Bloody hell, I've got flies in me bumhole! It also had pestilent breath that used a flame template, kinda like this one, although less luminous green, and you rolled a d6 for any enemy underneath it. On a 4+, they just took a wound with no save, although you could get a save roll with magic armor.
Screaming skull catapults were just like regular catapults, except it fires screaming skulls rather than normal rocks. Screaming Skull Catapult was not a clever name. Anyway, rather than it firing directly at a unit, you had to guess how far away the enemy was from the catapult in inches and then place your blast template there. Excuse me, I'm just having horrible flashbacks to 20 years ago and having to guess how far away things were from my whirlwind tank. It could also misfire and tear itself apart, although this seems pretty normal for that kind of unit at the time. The only major difference between this and a more conventional catapult seems to be the Screaming Skull thing, which could make people hit by it panic. You know, on account of the screaming.
And then there's the magic. Necromancers, liches and vampires, as well as using dark magic spells, could use necromantic magic. Going into how the magic system worked at the time is a little outside the scope of the video, but it involves spell cards, and there are many new spell cards found in this book. Some fun spells are the Dark Mist, which turned the caster into a mist that swirled across the battlefield to instantly move up to 24 inches. Apparently this is still around in the form of a card in the Age of Sigmar Champions card game. Venhel's Dance Macabre was a spell that allowed you to perform extra out-of-sequence actions with certain units using the invigorating power of chaos. This was particularly useful as it was the only way to make a lot of units be able to march as they lacked the ability normally. And the Curse of Years made an affected model start to age rapidly, possibly killing a model of old age if it isn't dispelled in some way, sticking with them over multiple turns. An effect anyone who's ever fought a Horde army without movement trays has definitely felt. This spell is still in Age of Sigmar, but it's currently only usable by Archon the Black and works radically differently now. Of course you can also summon more undead minions with various spells, but what kind of undead rules would it be if you couldn't?
There were quite a few special characters you could choose from too. Obviously there was Nagash, Supreme Lord of the Undead, although this is pre-glow-up Nagash with his terrible model. This Nagash's Mortis Blade could steal the wounds it inflicted to heal him, similar to his Soul Stealer spell now. There was the von Karstein vampires, Vlad and Isabella. Since they were married, if they were both present in a battle, then killing one would send the other into a frenzy and become subject to hatred against the model or unit that did the deed to their beloved. Actually, it got kinda grim if that happened as part of a campaign, since then you'd roll a d6, and on a roll of 1 to 3, the surviving character kills themselves over the despair of spending eternity alone. And on a 4+, they'd swear vengeance on all living things and become subject to frenzy and hatred for the rest of the campaign. Manfred von Karstein was also there. You also had Heinrich Kemmler, the Lich Master, whose very talkative skull staff allowed him to reveal spells and magical items his enemies were holding. Archon the Black, the Lich King, no not that one, who's still around although his current model has much less of a lead singer from the band Ghost vibe about them. Krell, Lord of the Undead, who had a big black axe that would leave splinters of itself in people hit with it, causing additional wounds in the magic phase and able to outright kill models between campaign games. Cetra, the Tomb King of Khemri, who had a flail made of skulls that would bite people hit with it, causing additional wounds, not to mention being hilarious. And finally, there's Dieter Helsnicht, DOOMLORD of Middenheim, who had the goofiest manticore that I love, and had a staff that hurled flaming skulls in a manner exactly like staffs usually do not.
Looking at these characters, it becomes really apparent why the units and the characters in this book would end up split between several factions later on. Like, the vampires have a really distinct feel to them, and Cetra's whole background talks about how he doesn't get on with the other undead. So the faction being split into vampire counts and Tomb Kings later on makes a lot of sense.
Now, there are some parts of this that we don't feel particularly confident in talking about, and those are the parts that relate to how it fits in with the wider Warhammer Fantasy lore and setting. It's just a really big thing and we don't have experience with it.
But we do know somebody who does, so now we're going to pass over to lore master and disembodied Irish accent Oculus Imperia, who has kindly decided to step in and do our job, but good.
So the interesting part about the lore, as presented in this book, is, well, it's all new. And I mean it, almost everything here was written and penned for this book first. 4th edition Warhammer was the first time bespoke army books were in fact a thing, previously having had their bestiaries for various models included in the rulebook or in the Warhammer Armies supplements, along with juicy little bits of flavor text. The 3rd edition rulebook describes the undead as an accepted reality in the Warhammer world because they were an incredibly staunch staple of the role-playing games Warhammer Fantasy had spun out of. 3rd edition had provided the framework for the Old World and how it operated, and the histories of elves, men, and dwarves in a sort of a rough outline. And now 4th would take this even further, fully fleshing out the history and lore of what had been, up to that point, a fairly threadbare fictional universe, at least compared to the one that it became. We're spun this massive millennia-spanning tale as a result, positioning at its very center the Bone Pope himself, Big Daddy Skellebones, Nagash, the great necromancer. As far as I'm aware, this book marks Nagash's big debut in canon, and what a debutante he is. Once a mortal human from ancient Nehekara, Nagash learned dark magic from a band of stranded dark elves, and set to wielding it to prolong his lifespan far beyond that of any of his fellow priest kings, eventually leading to the creation of a blood-based elixir that in turn created the first vampires. Eventually exiled by his countrymen after building a pyramid to attract the winds of black magic to Khemri, something of a recurring theme for Nagash across time and space, the great necromancer would only grow more powerful, as his unlife permitted him centuries of study and research. Almost a millennia later, he returned to the great city of Khemri, laying waste to its population and initiating a great ritual that would give rise to hundreds of undead kingdoms and bloodlines, setting in motion events that would shake the world for centuries to come. We're also treated to a full history of the infamous Van Karstein family, the central players in the vampire counts of Sylvania, a gloomy and cursed region of the Empire, persisting in its existence largely through the diffused negligence of ruling emperors. The notorious Vlad von Karstein deposed the last of the ruling von Drac family in the aftermath of a great plague. Slowly infecting the nobility of Sylvania with the vampiric curse, Vlad and his wife Isabella would become the Old World's first true vampire aristocracy, plunging the Empire into wars against the undead and blighting it for millennia with their offspring. This book is as stuffed with lore as any Warhammer book has ever been. The summary I've just given accounts for barely any of it, and it has aimed to recount the entire span of the world's history, timelines and all, and encompasses within that the sum total of all events pertaining to the undead, be they great, like Nagash, or lesser, like the necromancer Heinrich Kemmler. There's not much in the way of retcons here so much as unrestrained creation. This is a pair of authors giving the foundational treatise on the undead in Warhammer. Everything that would come after is built upon it. It would, of course, laterally change. 6th edition of fantasy introduced the Tomb Kings, expanding the lore of Nehekara, the land of the dead, beyond its focus on the cursed city of Khemri. Cetra the Imperishable would go from being a warlord of note to the undisputed ruler of all Tomb Kings, and depose Arkan the Black as the true and just owner of the 4-skeleton horse chariot. The vampire counts would similarly be developed, the focus on them expanding from the Sol von Karstein line to incorporate the Strigoi ghouls, the Necroc sorcerers, and the cunning Lamians, the latter of which were born of the line of Neferata, the first vampire Nagash created. The great necromancer himself would later become sidelined, retained in the lore as a mighty figure of wicked and deadly power, but treated very much as an aspect of history as opposed to the real and present threat he was in 4th, goofy model notwithstanding. All of this was, however, yet to come. As broad as the scope of 4th edition's lore was for the undead, it was nevertheless restrained, focusing on granting a history to the line of models Games Workshop was already producing, and those that would come with the book's release. Ghouls are ghouls, not strigoi, and mummies are mummies, not tomb kings. The latter are one of the archaic elements that would be entirely changed later. Cetra is included in this book, but is labeled as the Tomb King, firm emphasis on the singular there. He also wields the Staff of Osiris, because this was from the era where Warhammer would still just literally use real-world terms if they wished, just like how the explorers from Arabe are straight up referred to as Arabs. Dieter Hellschnicht, the Doomlord of Middenheim, is a major player in this book in a way that he would never be in a subsequent edition, as the split in the Undead between vampire counts and tomb kings left little room for human necromancers beyond Heinrich Kemmler to stay in the spotlight. There's a neat little bit of background to the cursed Bretonnian city of Mousillon, and its immaculately named ruler, Duke Jean-Luc, a man I desperately wish had been given a model. Beyond the usual delights of Warhammer naming convention subtlety, old Dieter's name literally translates to Hell Knight, the book is far more gothic in tone, with the goofiness still present but ebbing out to the hobby side, what with its full primary colour palette. The gothic prose bits, starring your and my best friends Gotrek and Felix many years before their debut novel, help reinforce this, as do the little bits of cultural flavor text, like how the residents of Sylvania used to bury their dead face down, lest they awaken and attempt to dig their way up. Reading the Army book now is a delight, as it not only shows you how much 4th edition was a revelation for the Warhammer Fantasy world, but also just how much of that world was expanded upon in the editions that followed. If you want to get the best and clearest primer on how the Undead in fantasy first really came into being, this is fully the way to do that.
You know, I wonder how much it had cost us to pay Oculus to just do this series for us from now on.
No, you could not afford me.
The art in this book bears some mention, since the artists are all ones we've seen in the 40k codexes we've previously covered, with the art being by John Blanche, Wayne England, and Mark Gibbons, with the cover art by David Gallagher, whose work has shown up on the covers of multiple things we've covered in this series. It's just really interesting to see artists whose work you're familiar with in a different setting. Also neat to see things like how similarly Mark Gibbons drew this vampire and the Blood Angel librarian Mephiston just a few years later.
Finally, let's take a look at the colour section of the book. As you would expect, it's mostly pictures of models, and they're adorable. That's not to disparage the skill of the sculptors or anything, it's bloody hard to do. It's just that most of them are skeletons, and skeletons just have a natural goofy energy about them. I mean, just look at these numbnuts, they're great. Some models of note are the Wraithlord, mostly because you probably think of a very different model when I say Wraithlord, this skeleton horn player who's defying reality by playing an instrument that requires lungs, a trend in skeletal musicians that I am glad to see has not ended. This ghost that really reminds me of the Haunter from the Dark World board game, this ghoul who is your uncle at a party, and these standard bearers since their banners were actually in the book for you to photocopy and paint yourself. That's not unique to this book or anything, but it's just always nice when they did that.
The colour section also had the start of Revenge of the Doomlord, which was a scenario in which Manticore-riding Weirdo and Doomlord Dieter Hellschnicht took on the forces of the Empire. It's one of those ones where it's a specific event that happened in universe, so not only did it have a very specific army list set up that you could use, but it also had a canonical outcome that your playthrough may or may not adhere to. For the record, canonically Dieter lost and got stabbed like super hard. He got better. Revenge of the Doomlord also had a neat section by Jervis Johnson discussing tactics you, as an undead player, could use. From highlighting how much you need to protect your general, maybe by hiding them amongst countless skeletons, after all, most of the army would disappear if the general died, to making sure you make use of the fact that most things in the army could cause the effect of fear or terror. Jervis even recounting a time he managed to make most of Andy Chambers' Skaven run away by plopping down a zombie dragon. Which sounds like a good laugh for everyone who isn't Andy Chambers' Skaven.
So that was Warhammer Armies Undead. What have we learned from our visit to the world of Warhammer Fantasy? Well, for one, that fantasy and 40k are often pretty similar in mechanics and presentation. A bold, hot take, I know. But it's been fascinating to look through something that feels both very familiar and very alien at the same time. And it's been useful to get some background on the setting as we're planning to give Age of Sigmar a shot next year. I mean, I know that the world we've been reading about doesn't exactly exist anymore, but, you know, whatever. It's also been interesting to see that some of those really characterful models that you can still buy for the Legions of Nagash army used to be named characters in books like this. Hell, you can see their old names in the URLs on the GW site, actually. Although, admittedly, these are models from much later than this book. The ones from this era were a little more, well, of the era.
All this makes Warhammer Armies Undead a really interesting book to look through in the present day. And as we discovered when we announced we were doing this video, many of you have a lot of nostalgia for it, so if you get the chance, it's worth looking at, or indeed revisiting. Granted, we could have also learned a lot of this by just playing more of the Total War Warhammer games, since a lot of the characters and factions we've read about are still kicking around in there, but I mean, why do things the easy way? We're not nerds.
Of course, many of you are probably wondering exactly why, of all of the Warhammer Fantasy books we could cover at the holiday season, we chose to do the one of shambling undead horrors.
And you know what? So are we.
Hey there, hope you're having a lovely festive period. We'd just like to put out a huge thank you to Oculus Imperia for all the work he did on this video. You should go check out his channel if you haven't already. It's really good, and you know, I think if you're into the stuff on this channel, then you'll quite like his. Also, thank you to, well, all of you for sticking with us through this hell of a year. Also, a big thank you to everyone whose name is going past right now. Their support on Patreon allows us to pay rent, which is jolly decent of them, so thank you. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave us a comment, or give it a like, or do whatever it is to the bell you're supposed to do. I don't really understand it, but yeah, thanks for watching, and we love every single one of you. Mwah.